The key weighs almost nothing. That's the first thing I always notice when I take it out of the small leather pouch where I keep it, how something so consequential, something I've carried for 11 years, could be so light in my palm. It's brass. Old brass, the kind that's been handled by so many hands it no longer looks yellow but has deepened into a color like burnt honey. It's about 3 inches long, with a bow at the top that was once engraved with a looping letter M for my grandfather's surname, Mercer, Marcus Elliott Mercer, who built grandfather clocks for 40 years in a workshop behind his house in rural North Carolina, and who left this particular key, the key to the last clock he ever made, to me alone. Not to my parents, not to my brother, to me. I keep it in the leather pouch in the top drawer of my office desk, between my notary seal and a small framed photo of my daughter Ellie. I am a trust and estate attorney. I have been for 16 years. My firm handles estates north of $2 million. Disputes involving family businesses, contested wills, and the particular, devastating genre of legal conflict that happens when the people who were supposed to love each other decide, at the worst possible moment, that they never really did. I have sat across my mahogany desk from grieving children, from furious siblings, from widows who couldn't understand why their husbands had quietly rewritten everything. I'm very good at what I do. I am very good at it because I learned, very young, the difference between what a family looks like from the outside and what it actually is. I learned that from my parents. This is the story of the day they walked into my office and asked me to save them, and the day I showed them exactly why I couldn't. My parents were beautiful people. I want to say that first, because I think it matters. When I describe what they did, when I lay it out, the way I would lay out evidence in a brief, I want you to understand that they weren't monsters in the way that word usually gets used. They weren't cruel for the pleasure of cruelty. They were something subtler and, in some ways, harder to survive. They were people who loved the idea of a life more than they loved the people inside it. My father, George Whitfield, was the kind of man who entered a room and made it brighter. Tall, gregarious, a salesman's handshake and a senator's vocabulary. He sold commercial real estate. He was spectacular at it for about 15 years. Then the market shifted and George didn't, and rather than adapt, he performed. He performed solvency. He performed success. He performed the role of a man whose family wanted for nothing, even as everything quietly began to erode. My mother, Sandra, was his partner in the performance. She was the woman at every neighborhood party who said, "We are just so blessed," in a tone that suggested she was merely stating a fact. She hosted beautifully. She dressed beautifully. She was the first to arrive at school events and the loudest to applaud, and she genuinely, truly believed that appearances were not just a version of the truth. They were the truth. If you said it confidently enough, it became real. My brother, Patrick, believed this too. Patrick was 4 years older than me and had inherited both their gifts, their charm, their ease, their absolute refusal to sit with discomfort. He was their golden child in the uncomplicated way that phrase usually means. He was loved loudly, celebrated loudly, and when he failed, which he did repeatedly, financially, he was bailed out loudly, and no one ever spoke of it again. I was not the golden child. I was the quiet one. The one who read too much. The one who, at age 9, corrected my father's arithmetic at the dinner table and watched his smile flicker in a way that told me I had broken an unspoken rule. The one who, at 16, when my parents told me we were temporarily restructuring our finances, went to the library and taught myself enough about bankruptcy law to understand what that actually meant. I didn't perform. I observed. I documented. Even then, I documented. When I was 22, my grandfather, my mother's father, Marcus, sat me down in his workshop. It smelled of sawdust and linseed oil. He was finishing what he told me was his last clock, a tall case clock in black walnut with brass fittings and a moon phase dial. He worked while he talked. His hands never stopped. He said, "Your mother is a beautiful woman, and she got it from her mother. God rest her. And she uses it the way a magician uses a scarf, to make sure you're always looking at the wrong hand. He said, I've been watching your father for 30 years. I've been watching your mother for 60. I love them. But I see them. He finished polishing the brass key and set it in my hand. He said, This is yours. Not because you're my favorite, though you are, but because you're the only one I trust to know what it opens. He passed away 4 months later. In his will, the clock went to my parents' home. The key came to me with a letter sealed in an envelope. He'd had notarized 3 years earlier. I didn't open the letter for 6 years. I'm going to tell you why. Was 24 when my parents told me I was on my own. The specific trigger was this. I had declined to co-sign a second mortgage refinance for their home. My father had structured a deal that required a co-signer with no debt and strong credit. I had both. But I was 2 years into law school, and the numbers, the actual numbers, the ones I'd asked to see and had spent a weekend analyzing, told me that the deal was not a restructuring. It was a delay, a beautiful, expensive delay. I told my father this, carefully, respectfully, with a written summary I had prepared. He told me I was a child who didn't understand how business worked. I told him I understood how it worked well enough to know that in 4 years, when this deal matured, the liability would be mine and his equity would be gone. He stood up. He pointed at the door of his study. He said with the particular cold quiet of a man who has never been told no by his own daughter, If you walk out of this house tonight without signing that paper, you are not my daughter anymore. I picked up my summary. I thanked him for dinner. I walked out. My mother did not come after me. Patrick called me 2 days later to tell me I was being dramatic. He had signed the paper. He was the good one. I did not speak to my parents again for 11 years. In that time, I finished law school. I clerked. I joined a firm, made partner in 9 years, which is considered unusually fast, and built a practice that I am proud of. I bought a house. I met and married my husband, David. We had Ellie. My parents were not at my wedding. They had never met their granddaughter, and I had been fine with that. Not easily. Not without the particular grief that comes from finally accepting a loss you spent years trying to prevent. But fine. Functional. Whole. In the way you become whole when you stop waiting for people to become who you needed them to be. I had built my own table. And then, on a Tuesday morning in March, my assistant knocked on my office door and told me that a George and Sandra Whitfield were in the reception area. They didn't have an appointment. Want to pause here and say something directly to you. If you have ever had family members who only reappeared when they needed something, if you've ever felt that particular nauseating drop in your stomach when a number you stopped expecting to see comes up on your phone, you already know what I felt when my assistant said their names. It's not anger, exactly. It's not even surprise. It's the feeling of a wound you thought had closed, proving that it hadn't. It had only quieted. If you've ever answered that call, or opened that door, or done exactly what I did, which was take 3 slow breaths, smooth my jacket, and say, please show them in. Drop the word steady in the comments. Because steady is the only word I have for what it takes to not feel what you're feeling long enough to handle what's coming. I came around from behind my desk and stood in the center of my office when they walked in. My father had aged. The broadness was still there, the physical confidence, but it had softened, gone to seed slightly, the way a former athlete looks when the discipline has left but the frame remains. My mother was still immaculate. She always would be. She was wearing a pale blue cashmere cardigan, and she looked at my office with the expression of a woman cataloging her surroundings. And I watched her clock the framed degrees on the wall, and the view of the city through the windows, and the small, orderly signs of a successful life. And I watched something flicker behind her eyes. She said, "You look well." I said, "Please sit down." I did not hug them. I did not offer pleasantries. I sat down behind my desk and I folded my hands and I waited. My father, to his credit, did not waste time. He was still a salesman. He knew when to skip the preamble. He said, "We're in trouble, Vivian." The house, the same house I had refused to co-sign for 11 years ago, was 3 months from foreclosure. They owed $300,000. The forbearance window was closing. Patrick, who had co-signed that second mortgage refinance, had declared personal bankruptcy the previous year. He was in no position to help. They had liquidated their retirement accounts. They had borrowed from 2 family members who were now unwilling to lend further. They needed $300,000. My mother reached across my desk and put her hand over mine. She said, "You are so successful, Vivian. We are so proud of you. We always knew you would be." I looked at her hand on mine. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked up at her face, and I could see her believing it, truly believing in that moment that it was not false, that this was the story, that she had always been proud of me, that the 11 years had been a misunderstanding, a gap, a pause, that we were here now, and family was family, and surely, I said, "I need you to look at something." I opened the top drawer of my desk. I took out the leather pouch. I set it on the desk between us. My mother's eyes went to it immediately. She recognized it. I watched her recognize it. I said, "Do you know what this is?" My mother said slowly, "Your grandfather's key." "His key," I agreed. "The key to the clock he left in your living room. The clock that is still in your living room, I'm told." My father shifted in his chair. I said, "When Grandpa Marcus died, I didn't open his letter for 6 years. I want to tell you why." They were both very still. "Because?" I said. I knew it contained information I wasn't ready to act on. I could feel that from the weight of the envelope. And I had learned something by then about the difference between knowing something and having to do something about it. I was 22 years old, and I had just lost the only adult in my family who had ever told me the truth, and I wasn't ready to find out the rest of it. My mother said, "Vivian, I don't see what this has to do with—" I opened the letter. I continued, in exactly the tone I use when I'm reading from a trust document in mediation, level, unhurried, entirely without feeling. On the night of my 31st birthday, David was asleep. I sat at the kitchen table and I read it. And then I spent 4 years, in my spare time, doing what Grandpa Marcus had asked me to do, verifying everything he had documented. I reached into the drawer again and placed a document on the desk. A tabbed-bound document, maybe 60 pages. What Grandpa Marcus had documented, I said, was this. When I was 11 years old, my parents established a custodial trust account in my name, seeded by Marcus himself with $140,000. His intention was for it to grow until I was 25. He'd done the same for Patrick. My father's jaw had gone rigid. Patrick's account, I said, was accessed for the first time when he was 15. A small amount, tuition for a private school, reasonable, documented, authorized. I opened to the first tab. My account was accessed for the first time when I was 8. The full balance was liquidated over 4 years, between my 8th and 12th birthdays. The funds were used as a down payment on a house. Silence. "Your house," I said. "The house you're asking me to save." I pushed the key across the desk. The brass key, the burnt honey key that had been light in my palm for 11 years. "I have the bank records. I have the custodial account statements. I have the original trust documents with Grandpa Marcus's signature. I have, in this packet, the forensic accounting I had prepared in 2018 with a certified financial forensics examiner. The money used to purchase your home, The home that is now in foreclosure was mine. Taken without my knowledge, without authorization, and without ever being repaid. My mother made a sound. A very small sound, like something in her chest had shifted. My father said, with what I could tell was enormous effort. That was 25 years ago. Vivian. It wasn't done maliciously. There were circumstances. I know, I said. I know exactly what the circumstances were. I read every page. And I want you to know that I've thought very carefully for a very long time about what I felt about those circumstances. I paused. The answer is nothing. I feel nothing about it anymore. I processed it. I grieved it. I moved on. I leaned forward slightly. But I cannot give you $300,000 to save a home that was purchased with $140,000 that belonged to me. And I cannot pretend, in order to do so, that the last 25 years happened differently than they did. My father held it together longer than I expected. I'll give him that. He sat with it for almost a full minute, this man who had walked into my office, with the bearing of a man who expected to walk out, with a check, and I watched him cycle through the stages with the clinical detachment of someone who has watched this particular movie many times in a professional context, disbelief, calculation, appeal. He said, "You would let your parents lose their home." I said, "I won't be making that decision. The bank will." "You're a trust attorney," he said, his voice rising just slightly, just enough. "You know how to structure a loan, a gift." "I do," I agreed. "And I've chosen not to." And that was when my mother broke, not slowly. Not with the dignified crumbling of a woman overwhelmed by circumstance. Sandra Whitfield, who had hosted Christmas for 30 years without a hair out of place, who had said, "We are just so blessed," at every neighborhood party, who had put her hand on mine 40 minutes ago with perfect composure, she broke completely. She said, "How can you sit there?" Her voice had gone high and ragged, entirely unlike her. "How can you sit there so cold? I am your mother. I raised you." "You raised me," I said quietly. "We did everything for you, everything. And you would take notes. You kept notes like a lawyer against your own family." "I am a lawyer," I said. "We needed you. You were supposed to—" She stopped. She pressed her hand to her mouth. And then the sound came out of her. Not words, not crying exactly, but something between them. Something wordless and broken, the sound of a story she had been telling herself for 30 years cracking open at the seams. My father put his hand on her shoulder. He looked at me over her head, and for the first time in my memory, my father looked old. He said, "This isn't who we raised you to be." I considered that for a moment. I genuinely considered it. Then I said, "You raised me to be exactly who I am. You just didn't intend to." I stood up. I pressed my intercom. I said to my assistant, "Please let Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield know the exit when they're ready." I left the brass key on the desk, between the document and my notary seal, and I walked to my window and I looked out at the city and I listened to my mother's crying slow and stop. And I listened to the sound of two people standing up and gathering themselves. And I listened to the door open and close. I did not turn around. I did not offer forgiveness. I did not offer a loan, a bridge, a path, an alternative. I had thought about whether I had spent months thinking about it, and I had decided that the most honest thing I could do for both of us was to simply stop participating in the performance, The clock in their living room had not been wound in years. As far as I knew, the key was still on my desk. Some locks are better left unopened. There is a version of this story where I give them the money. I've thought about that version. I've sat with it. I've let it run all the way to the end. The gratitude that would last maybe 6 months. The slow drift back to the dynamic. The way I would have made their comfort more important than my own integrity. And they would have accepted it as their due. Because that is the story they have always been telling. I chose a different story. Not a cruel one. Not a vengeful one. I did not take them to court. I did not publish the forensic accounting. I did not, as Patrick later accused me of in a voicemail I have saved, ruin the family. I simply declined to save it on terms that required me to pretend I was someone I'm not. Boundaries don't have to be loud to hold. That is the truest thing I know. The brass key on my desk is not a trophy. It is not a weapon. It is a reminder that what was taken from me did not break me, and that what I built afterward is entirely, irrevocably mine. If you were raised by people who performed love but didn't sustain it, if you have spent years trying to fit yourself into a family story that was never quite true, I want you to know you are allowed to put the key down. You are allowed to choose your own lock. Subscribe if this story moved you. There are more where this came from, and every one of them is about people who found the paperwork, sat with the grief, and walked out of the room with their dignity intact. I'll see you in the next one.